Welcome to this morning's American Security Project webinar. This is an on-the-record conversation that will be available for attribution. A recording of this conversation will be posted on our website and sent to those who registered for the event. All audience members will be muted during the discussion, but please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions to the panelists. With that, Patrick Costello, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Annie. Good morning from Washington. I'm Patrick Costello, the CEO of the American Security Project. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's virtual meeting. As this is my first virtual meeting as CEO, I can think of no one better to join me than Elbridge Colby. Bridge is one of our most thoughtful and highly regarded defense strategists. He most recently served in the Pentagon as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development. In that role, he served as the lead official in the development and rollout of the department's preeminent planning guidance, the 2018 National Defense Strategy, which focused the department on the challenges to U.S. military superiority posed by China and Russia. His government services also included tours at the State Department and within the intelligence community. He's also done tours in the think tank community with posts at CNAS and CNA. And he's the author of The Strategy of Denial, American Defense in an Age of Great Power Conflict, which was released earlier this fall. It's actually quite an exceptional work on how we should think about war and peace in this age of great power competition. And he artfully uses the lessons of history to illustrate how and why U.S. defense strategy must change. Bridge provides great analytic clarity as he tackles the most important strategic problem facing American foreign policy and national security practitioners today: what to do about China's rise and their territorial ambitions, how America should prepare to address the China challenge. It's a definitive work on defense strategy, but more important than that, it's an extremely timely work. As Chairman Mark Milley said at the Aspen Security Forum this week, we're witnessing one of the largest shifts in global geostrategic power that the world has ever seen. As Annie mentioned, this conversation is on the record. It will be recorded and posted on the website. I'm going to engage Bridge in conversation to start the program before we allow you to pose your own questions. When we get to that point, please use the Q&A function that's at the bottom of your Zoom webinar window. Bridge, thank you so much for joining us. Before we get into the book itself, to start, the emergence of great power competition with China and Russia has profoundly changed the conversation about U.S. defense issues from what it was during the post-Cold War and post-9/11 era. And the 2018 NDS and the 2017 NSS reflected this new reality that the distribution of power across the world is changing, creating new threats, and it formally reoriented U.S. national security strategy and defense strategy towards an explicit primary focus on great power competition. And China, in particular, has rapidly become more assertive. So again, before getting into the book, how did your experience having the pen on the NDS, drafting the NDS, shape your thinking about this challenge?
Well, first of all, Patrick, thanks very much for the introduction. I'm honored, and it's a particular privilege to be on here with you and in your first engagement with ASP. So this congratulations to you, and delighted to be on here with you, and look forward to the discussion. Well, I mean, as you know, I think as the lead official in developing the NDS there, I see a team effort, but the book is actually really shaped by that experience a lot. What I really came away with from the Pentagon experience was the need for a sort of comprehensive, coherent, very kind of lucid explanation for what we need to do and why in an accessible form. And whether I achieve that is for others to judge, but that's what I strove for. And I mean, people might think that in the Pentagon, the sort of connection of strategy, so to speak, to operations and tasks and hard choices would always be implicit in people's fingers, maybe, but it's really not. I think people have really become accustomed to the world of unipolarity, if you will, of the post-Cold War world. And it wasn't always clear, why are we making these choices? And, you need to explain it. I mean, the defense establishment is millions of people. There's Congress, there's the people who influence Congress and the defense establishment, there's the executive branch. So that's what I really strove, in a sense. This is kind of I think of it as sort of like my platonic version, at least, of the national defense strategy kind of logic. Obviously, it's clearer, we're more focused on certain points, but very consistent on the whole. But that was my hope, and unfortunately, I think the urgency and the need for that kind of explanation is still here. Is in fact much more pressing, given how formidable the Chinese are and are going to become, and how we've kind of continued to lag behind the intensity of that challenge.
Great, thanks, Bridge. Now let's get into the book itself. Can you just briefly present some of the broad themes, and then we can get into the specifics?
Sure. I mean, I think that there's a sort of two-level argument, and denial is kind of central to both of them. You know, look, a defense strategy is about war and peace, about people dying and killing and so forth. So it's got to be connected to some, in my view, some sensible grand strategy. What are we about? And I root this in, I would say, an enlightened but self-interested approach, which is, you know, fundamentally American foreign policy and defense strategy should be about American security, freedoms, and prosperity. And, you know, basically to make it very telegraphic, in order to have that in the world, and I think this is a deeply rooted American foreign policy objective, we can't allow another country to be so powerful that they could impose their will on us and essentially undermine or diminish those core goods that make our nation what it is. And basically what that means is we can't let another state dominate one of the key regions of the world. And if you look at a map of the world, of GDP, for instance, and there's some great maps by my friend Andy Rhodes in the book, so hats off to him. If you see that, it's still concentrated. And, you know, people talk about George Kennan and his speech at National Defense University. The industrialized areas are still Asia, Europe, and the Persian Gulf to some extent, mostly because of the hydrocarbons. It's expanded in Asia in particular, but that's basically where the critical regions of the world are, and we can't let another state dominate them. And really, by far, the most significant threat of that happening, and where it's most significant, would be China and Asia. Asia's 50% roughly of global GDP. It's heading in that direction, and China's about a fifth or quarter of global power or GDP, and half of Asia. So so we need to deny China the ability to dominate Asia. And if we're going to do that, we can't do it on our own for a variety of reasons. We need a coalition, you know, and that's not just a sort of hippy dippy, you know, kumbaya kind of coalition. We got to work with other countries because the Chinese are just too strong and capable and resolute, and they're there. You know, we're far away, right? So our interests attenuate over distance. And so, but, you know, if we're going to make that coalition work, we got to make it resilient, resistant to China's best strategy. And China's best strategy is to try to pick that coalition apart. It's not to start a huge war, Hitler-like, with everybody and get everybody super angry at them. And I think rather it's to kind of cause a run on the bank by making an example of a few members of that coalition, particularly ones that are connected to the United States. So we got to be able to stand up to that. And we're the only ones who are strong enough. I mean, I was going back and forth on Twitter with somebody the other day who'd written a review. My instincts, actually, I'd love to do free riding. I'd love to go back to a 19th century kind of approach, but the whole 19th century approach was predicated on Great Britain playing the balancer role, the cornerstone balancer. And, you know, United Kingdom ain't what it used to be, you know, so we're the only ones that can pull that off. And so, you know, we got to do that in Asia. The key here is that, and this is where the second part comes in of denial, is that military power is going to be really critical. I mean, I think a lot of people sort of take as a given what I think our goal is, which is to make military affairs sort of marginal or secondary. But if military affairs and war and peace and force are neglected, they will become sort of central and determinative. I mean, think about a neighborhood. If you don't have good law and order in a neighborhood, you're not going to worry about your real estate or your commercial investments or whatever. You're gonna get out of there or whatever. So I think the problem is that the Chinese are seeing the limits of their ability to use, say, economic coercion or gray zone stuff to get countries to toe their line. You know, you can see with Australia right now. Actually, it's had the reverse effect. So, but the downside of that point is that they have a really increasingly strong military instrument. The China military power just made that report that came out just makes that all the more clear. So, what is China going to do? China's incentive is to pick a part of that big coalition, particularly one that's connected paradoxically to the United States, since the sort of the core, the steel and the backbone of this coalition is American, what I call differentiated credibility, kind of local credibility. And that's, you know, so that's paradoxically, that's what China wants to go after, because if it does what Russia did and attacks Ukraine or something like that, it actually just strengthens NATO, right? China doesn't want to achieve that or doesn't want to create that dynamic. And so what we need to do is to be able to defend those vulnerable parts of our coalition, particularly the ones that are linked to us, to the degree necessary for them to keep going. And this is the critical point about what denial is. Denial is a military standard. It's a military standard that is linked to a political objective, which is we need to defend those allies. And that, by extension, I include Taiwan. It's about 75% of an ally, maybe 66%. But basically, it's everybody in the region understands that it's connected to us. Their credibility is on the line. Just enough for them to keep going. Think Britain 1940. I mean, more would be better, but that's the standard. We don't need to dominate China. We don't need to regime change China. We don't need to dismember China. We don't need China to surrender, what have you. We just need to defend Taiwan. And if we can do Taiwan, we can do Japan, Philippines, Australia, et cetera. The coalition will sustain itself, and China will have to negotiate the terms of its further rise in a way that respects our collective interests.
Great, thank you. I want to do a bit of a deeper dive on Taiwan. You give it significant treatment in the book. So multi-parted question here. First, and you unpack this a bit in a recent post in the Wall Street Journal. What makes the threat to Taiwan so urgent? Why is Taiwan a key strategic interest to the United States? And part of prosecuting a war, and you again give this some treatment in the book, is the matter of resolve. And so my perspective is that there might be a misalignment in our interests and resolve vis-a-vis China's interests in resolve if there is a Taiwan contingency. So if there were what you term a limited war over Taiwan, how could the United States persuade Beijing to concede given that misalignment of interest and resolve?
Excellent question. I mean, you cut to the heart of it. I mean, so let me say up front that I regard Taiwan as sort of like a 70-30 decision, like it's 70% in our interest. It's kind of it's a strong but not existential interest, right? But the problem is that an interest like that, it's important so that the loss of Taiwan to the United States would be a very significant blow. There's a kind of presumption behind a lot of the arguments about why not to defend Taiwan, that we would sort of be able to kind of just pick up right after Taiwan fell and things would go on as they were. But that's not right. I mean, the basic reasons are two. One is Taiwan is very, very important to what I call our differentiator, kind of local credibility. I mean, if you're in Japan or Manila or Seoul or Hanoi, you're going to look at what happens to Taiwan because that's really relevant. That's what you're thinking about. This is the PLA, it's the Chinese. It's like right next door. This is not Afghanistan or Serbia or Kosovo or whatever. So it's very relevant to you. And if the United States either doesn't defend Taiwan or does so fecklessly in a way that's not effective, it's very rational if you're in Manila or Hanoi or Seoul or even Tokyo to say, well, I guess the Americans are kind of scared of the Chinese, because the reality is, you know, the TRA and the 6 assurances, and actually the Biden administration has actually strengthened, if anything, our public commitment to Taiwan. You know, oh, the Americans will come up with some reason why they're not going to defend us in Manila because people, oh, well, there's a treaty. Well, there was a treaty with South Vietnam. You know, I mean, we've had we made all kinds of pledges in Afghanistan and Iraq. I mean, I was against those, but that is what it is. You know, we can always come up with some way. We got out of the ABM treaty. You know, if you're a smart actor, you're going to say, I'm going to be strongly incentivized to cut my deal. So the paradox, and then the second point is Taiwan is very significant militarily. It's right there in the middle of what's called the first island chain of Japan, down through Taiwan, through the Philippines, right? It's the natural barrier for maritime Asia. And the reality is all the important stuff is on the Western side, other than the United States itself, basically. It's all on the Western side of the Pacific. It's not like in the middle, right? So we got to defend forward. That's the unfortunate reality. And the reality is actually, if we don't defend Taiwan, I think we're going to have to do more dramatic stuff. So this is the paradox of the counterpoint to the Taiwan argument is, oh, okay, are we going to become allies with Vietnam now? Are we going to, like, what, Thailand? We're going to force Thailand, which is, by the way, hedging towards Beijing. Because how are you going to compensate for the loss of Taiwan? My basic kind of like putting it very simplistically, we're better off defending islands. That's our strong suit. Navy, Air Force, space, technology, not putting our people into the meat grinder. That's not what we're about. It's not our strong suit. Unlike, you know, the Chinese have done that. They did that against us in Korea. So that's the reality. But again, it's not 100% interest. But it's also very vulnerable, and it's a tough military problem. This is why I'm obsessed about it from a military point of view, because you compensate, exactly to your point, Patrick, for the lack of a clear advantage in resolve by giving yourself better military options, right? And this is where one of the things that drove me up the wall in the Pentagon is often I have military people saying, well, we could, you know, economic warfare, or we could expand the war. And it's like, no, your job is not to put extra pressure on the American civilian population, 330 million people who pay 3.5% of their income for the national security state. Your job is to give them good options, like, hey, we can fight a local war and defend Taiwan, not, oh, we're going to respond to the loss of Taiwan by blowing up, you know, starting a war in you know, a nuclear war or something like that as our only option. So that's why I'm so focused on it, you know. But the reality is, if we don't do this, it may become untenable, and then we will have to draw the line behind Taiwan. That we may get to that point. I don't want to get to that point because that'd be very damaging, and it's not worth it, and it would be foolish. But inaction is taking us in that direction. I mean, I think just the urgency is Chinese have the will, both for irredentist reasons, and it's geopolitically to their advantage for the reasons I just laid out. They increasingly are close to having their way. China military power report was a bit soft, but it was basically signaling that the Davidson window is real. Well, it said that. It said by 2027, the Chinese hope to have very credible options. Okay. And I think there's reason to think they might have that beforehand. And the third point is there's a window potentially, which is that we're finally waking up. Started with a third offset strategy of the peerless Bob work. We tried to continue and expand and sort of develop it with the national defense strategy. I think the current Pentagon, while I have some issues, they're generally focused on China. Okay, but a lot of that stuff's not going to come into the force until later this decade or early next decade. Those submarines of AUKUS are going to come in maybe by 2040. So China's got some time sensitivity, and that makes the problem all the more urgent. What I'm trying to do now, I mean, there's the book, but there's also the op-ed, is like, we kind of blew the chance for a graceful transition because people were saying, oh, we need to be balanced, and Bridge, you're exaggerating. And it's like, well, now we live in that world. So now if we don't do it, now we're looking at like, the British pulling out everywhere east of Aden in 1967, 69, or what have you. If we don't, and so people who are talking about balance and, oh, don't exaggerate, they're leading you astray. Because if we lose in Taiwan, we're going to have to absolutely drop everything else. No question. And that's where we're headed right now.
Okay, so let's play out a Taiwan contingency in a bit more detail. Just wondering what your thoughts are in terms of assistance the United States can provide to allow for the defense of Taiwan should there be aggressive action from China. Jim Stavridis has put out what he's termed a porcupine strategy, just make seizing the main island of Taiwan so expensive and so costly that Chinese would then withdraw. How can we provide them with the assistance to what you term in the book, defend in depth?
Yeah. So the notion that Taiwan could defend itself against a determined Chinese attack is not credible. So, I mean, there is this argument out there that we should help the Taiwans and that somehow offers like them. It's not a real alternative. So people should understand that. I mean, look, we rolled over Iraq in 1990 and 2003, which was a far more formidable military than the Taiwans are. I mean, certainly in 1990, it was much more. I mean, people say these things about sea mines and stuff. You can deal with that stuff, A, with capabilities, B, if you're willing to take losses, which the Chinese pretty manifestly are. So let's be clear about that. So Taiwan has no hope if the Americans aren't willing to come. The Taiwans need to, essentially, and what I tell them repeatedly is they need to, let's say our interest is here. They need to make sure that our costs and risk perception is below that level, right? So they essentially, their investments need to be ideally literally integrated, but at least, metaphor, sort of indirectly integrated with our own, which is to buy time and increase the costs and difficulties of the Chinese to get across or to subordinate them by blockade. And in that case, what the United States can provide certainly right now is long-range strike, submarine capability. The Taiwans will never have anything like that, obviously, and they shouldn't even try. The Taiwan should focus on anti-ship cruise missiles, and there's very promising legislation that's been introduced recently on this to force them to do this. We should not be shy. We should not respect. We should shut the door in their faces if they ask for things like F-35s, because what that is doing is killing more Americans. And if we're going to come to their aid, they should do what it makes sense. And the fact is that the Americans have this huge military establishment, which is not always right, but it has a lot more input and output and analytic capability. And what they need to do is sea mines, anti-ship cruise missiles, air defense, resilience, to make the porcupine is not a freestanding entity. The porcupine buys time. And, even things like, look, the Chinese have got to get across the straits, 100 miles. If it's just the Taiwans, they'll be able to do it, no problem, certainly in the near term. But, if the Taiwans can force the Chinese to break apart the flotilla so that ships become more vulnerable, as they say they're outside of an air defense. I mean, I don't know. I'm just speculating. Others are much more expert on that. That's good for us. Then we can get at them more easily. And that's the sort of thing that we want the Taiwans to do, which they're making some progress, but far from enough from what's required.
Great, thanks. I would invite our guests to start to think about their questions and begin to pose them in the Q&A chat box. Before I get to audience questions, I do want to take a step back, and you call for the establishment of an anti-hegemonic coalition to counter China's territorial ambitions in the Western Pacific. We have a variety of relationships, alliances, cooperation agreements with nations throughout the Western Pacific and Indo-Pacific. One thing I was quite struck by is one of those arrangements is the Quad. And you said that the Quad would be insufficient, would be an insufficient anti-hegemonic coalition. Can you just play out that argument for me?
Sure. I mean, I'm sort of against an Asian NATO. I actually think the Quad could be a decent basis. The anti-hegemonic coalition is more like a descriptive thing in our own head to understand what's happening. People don't even like, I don't think Vietnam would ever, well, there's not in the near term going to sign up for being in an anti-hegemonic coalition, but like we know and they know that they can be in it. India did, the Quad is, put out flags and getting together and talking about nice things. Really what it is countries that are working somewhat together in whatever modality to check China's regional domination. And one just point of clarification, if I could, Patrick, is that it's territorial. It's really more geopolitical ambitions, because I don't think China has territorial ambitions beyond well, very, very broad territorial ambitions beyond Taiwan. But it's more that they would set up a kind of a hegemonic position. Look, I think the Quad could be part of it. Other, AUKUS. But from our point of view, we should think of this as countries that are kind of collaborating together in whatever modality to check China's domineering ambitions. But what I'm worried about right now, to get to your point about timeliness, is I'm worried that we're taking too many victory laps over kind of political symbolism over like the Quad, which honestly, at the end of the day, doesn't, if the Chinese face shot us with a military step, well, doesn't really mean anything. I mean, there's no added, the Indians haven't promised to do something else. I'm not against it, but I think we should recognize what we really need to do right now is to take the military, make sure the Chinese don't see advantage in going the military option, so that then the competition will be in the economic, political, technological range. But right now I'm worried that we're going to open up the military option for them, and then that will change the political, economic, technological challenge, right? I mean, take the semiconductors, right? If China seizes Taiwan, well, it's going to have a big advantage in semiconductors right there.
Absolutely. I'm going to turn to our first question from the audience. Again, this one goes back to playing out a Taiwan contingency. And they're really asking about, there's a number of vulnerable islands outside of the main island of Taiwan in the Taiwan Strait. Should the Chinese start to seize those islands and with the question in terms of Ukraine type strategy to just change the conditions on the ground, what should the response be?
I actually think almost nothing. I mean, I think there's a reason that the Chinese have never seized those islands, which is that it would backfire on them, because it looks, the Russians kind of what they did in Ukraine actually kind of backfired on them by strengthening NATO, right? I mean, they gained the immediate objective, which was, I guess, Ukraine, not affiliating with the European Union and so forth. But if China seizes like Quemoy and Matsu, it doesn't mean anything. In fact, we never actually covered Quemoy and Matsu under the Mutual Defense Treaty that Eisenhower gave to Chiang Kai-shek specifically. So our and the TRA, I think, continued that language. It refers to Formosa, the island, and the Penghus or Pescadores, they used to be called. So like, I don't know, I wouldn't do anything except say, well, look how dangerous these guys are. They will come after you. Now you really need to do something about it. But, it's possible they do that. I wouldn't if I were they, but, don't stop your opponent when he's making a mistake if they do.
Right. I want to turn to Europe. There's been some interesting developments in terms of Europe's perspective towards Taipei and Beijing, their recent moves to strengthen relations with Taiwan. I'm wondering the utility of a Europe in an anti-hegemonic coalition, as well as how the Biden administration might underpin the momentum of Europe's gradual shift away from the PRC to the ROC.
So I think Europe has almost no utility in Asia as a military weight, and therefore kind of geopolitically its weight in the Asian Pacific Asian context is essentially negligible. And I think we should I mean, if they want to sail a ship through Asia, I don't, okay, but like we shouldn't get too excited about it. Really, what the Europeans need to do is take care of their own neighborhood, which they're not doing. And this is, Europe is important. It's the second most important theater for us, other than, our own, of course, but Asia first, then Europe. And the Russians are a threat. I mean, they're very dangerous, and they are revanchist and assertive. So there is a threat, but, people kind of throw this at me, and I'm like, well, okay, but we have a bigger threat, so we have to take care of our heart disease problem before we deal with our migraines. Like one is going to kill us, the other's not. So, and there's a solution, which is European NATO, which vastly larger than Russia in GDP terms, taking up its responsibility under a minimum of 2%, it should be higher, but 2%, and shouldering the conventional defense burden for itself, which A, was the original vision of General Eisenhower and General Marshall, by the way. B, is totally within their power. And actually, see, a lot of them are doing this. I mean, the Poles doing great, the Finns, Swedes are doing better, Norwegians doing better. The Brits actually doing very well, exceeding 2%, even in the midst of the pandemic. There's one country that's the problem, and it's the critical one, is Germany. And I personally find it unconscionable that they don't meet their security responsible, given all the water under the bridge over the last 75 years. But I've tried that with them. It doesn't seem to work. And now they have a government that's probably less keen to be open-minded to this. But, I think they should do it. And I think it's in their interests. I actually, as part of this kind of campaign, I put an article in a German language defense journal, trying to make this point to them. I mean, but at the end of the day, if the Germans are essentially calling our bluff, which is, are we actually going to focus on Asia? I mean, my view is, even if the Russians attacked first, we would have to withhold forces for Taiwan contingency, because it's more important and we don't have enough. So the Germans are essentially calling our bluff. And my view is that we should, put our cards on the table. And if at the end of the day, we'll say, nope, you're on your own. And that's tough. But we've been saying this now for 10 years. We've said it politely under Gates. We said it sort of passive aggressively under President Obama. We said it pretty brusquely under President Trump. And, a lot of countries are doing better, but, I don't know what else to say. I've been banging on this drum for several years now. It makes me kind of sad, actually, that it has to come to this, but that's where we are. And then I think, economically is the main area where we need to work with the Europeans vis-a-vis China, which is, China's going to be a market of 1.4 billion people. So if we get the military picture right, this is going to be more and more of an economic challenge and competition. China's got 1.4 billion people, enormous scale for their companies, AI, et cetera. And we're going to have to generate scale. And I know trade is a dirty word, and I think in a lot of ways, rightfully, trade is a dirty word. I mean, I think a lot of Americans feel aggrieved, and I sympathize with that. But on the other hand, we're going to have to generate comparable scale, just from a geopolitical perspective. So we're going to have to work with our allies. And Europe is just the largest other market out there, well, I guess India, but developed market. And that's where I think we should be pushing the Europeans on China more, rather than specifically on the security, getting directly involved security-wise.
Great, thank you. I'm going to paraphrase one of the questions that's in the that's in the chat. So I think it's safe to stipulate that regional hegemony in the Western Pacific is China's ultimate goal. So if you could kind of unpack a bit more China's military strategy, you call it a focused and sequential strategy. So beyond Taiwan, what are, and I hate to use the term domino effect because of the historic connotations, but what would be the domino effect?
Yeah. The thing that was right about the domino effect is that countries look at what happens to other countries. I mean, that's just like human nature, right? I mean, if you, people look at credit, in writing this book, I always had Vietnam kind of in my head. And the thing about Vietnam is that it sort of took a lot of concepts that were valid and took them to the sort of an illogical degree. But I go in the book, it's like, well, if you want to get a mortgage, you got a credit report, right? That's the most fundamental thing you can buy, and people ask about your credibility, right? So obviously credibility matters, right? Obviously countries are going to look and say, well, what happened? Now, it's not like, do you cheat at golf or tennis or whatever, but it's like, do you pay your bills? That matters. The thing that was wrong about the domino is that there's sort of this inexorable and is wholly interconnected. I clearly distinguish it from, I think it was good that we got out of Afghanistan. I didn't think the way we did it was good. It was catastrophe, but but that's sort of a different different story. I think the thing about the Chinese best military strategy is, I mean, Taiwan's their best option, their best target for a variety of reasons. But then, if their goal geopolitically is to cause this coalition to collapse or kind of, be feckless, then I think what you do next is you look at a country that's tied to the United States and that's weak and vulnerable, and that would probably be the Philippines. And the thing is that people confuse, and it's justifiable, but they confuse China's desire to China's willingness to invade other countries with the desire to annex them. And the point I always make is, like, we didn't desire to annex Iraq in 2003. George W. Bush wanted to coerce Saddam Hussein to give up his WMD, and the only way to do that Bush felt was to invade the country, right? I mean, we didn't want to, there are any number of other examples of this. And so what I think China, and the problem is that, what China would be asking of Manila is a fundamental reorientation of its strategy, and basically to defer to China. This is what their regional hegemony would be, is like, you have to take your security, economic, trade, probably political cues and boundaries from China. You'd have to buy into their social, some way, their social capital system. Your economy would be centered around them, et cetera. It's your regulatory framework. I mean, the things that matter, right? You'd have your own flag probably and all that. But I think if China is going to want that against the Philippines, given the fact that they're going to be, have us on their side, presumably, I think China's going to have to invade them. Right, it's going to basically get in there and get them in Manila, do what we would do. What do we do to Manuel Noriega? Right, you go in there, you drop a bunch of guys by air, you sail some ships over there, and you say, this is how it's going to be. And because if you don't do that, then they're going to say, no thanks, we'll stick with the Americans. And China doesn't want to be in that situation. And then I think if they pulled that off against the Philippines, or could credibly do so, right? This is what win without fighting really is like, Philippines knows how this is going to go down, that the Chinese are going to totally win. And they're going to be really angry if the Philippines resist them. So they're just going to give up beforehand. That's win without fighting, not some kind of gong show ninja stuff. It's like, we all know how this would go. And I think if that happened, then people would really be, and this is one of the things that's kind of struck me as I wrote the book, like the amount of buffer between Taiwan falling and things really changing could actually be a lot thinner than people appreciate. So a lot of this sort of offshore balance or critique of my argument is, well, yeah, Taiwan would fall, but then Japan would build up. And it's like, well, A, they're not building up now. And B, maybe the Chinese wouldn't wait. Maybe the Chinese would say, if we're going to regard it as a hostile act, if you increase your defense budget and deploy forces to the Southwest Islands, and as hostage, we're going to hold the Ryukyus, Okinawa and so forth as collateral or whatever. I mean, if they're willing to pull the trigger on Taiwan, why wouldn't they be willing to do that? And they're building a military to do it. That's the most credible signal possible. So,
right. Moving beyond the Indo-Pacific, one questioner is asking about the need to rebalance away from the Middle East. You do provide some treatment of this in your book. So if you could just kind of unpack what our interests are there. Is it still an important region for they say U.S. hegemony, but just the geopolitical importance of that as a region, but also the geopolitical inside of the Middle East. There's no real regional hegemon who will emerge, again, provided with some treatment in the book. So just unpack that a bit for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Middle East on the whole is not very important at all. And certainly beyond the Gulf, it's almost negligible if you look at like GDP, so in the kind of grand scheme of things, it's we pay way more attention to the Middle East than it requires from our interests. The Gulf itself is important because hydrocarbons are important and they're going to be important and they're readily leverageable as a source of wealth. But the people who are most, dependent on it are actually like the Europeans. And so I don't know why we're the ones, footing the bill on that. And the key thing, and I was speaking to an audience of Middle Eastern experts recently, is like, well, if we keep the Chinese locked up in the Pacific militarily, they can't really project power in the Middle East. So it's kind of like we get things right in the decisive theater, we'll be okay from the Chinese perspective in the Middle East. And what's so the Middle East not that important. And who's the plausible hegemon? Iran. Iran's like a fifth of the power of the Middle East. So it's not that serious of a threat. in the geopolitical context. And there's a latent group of states, or actually not even latent, that are willing to do something about it, which is the Abraham Accords group. So my view is like, let's bolster them. So like, give them the weapons that they want, back them up, and it's like, well, some of these governments are doing some pretty nasty things in various, either internally or in Yemen or whatever. Well, what's our priority? We can't do everything. So my view is we should be selling the Emiratis and the Saudis and the Egyptians or whoever's willing to be in this game, of course, the Israelis, what they need. It's rationally correlated with balancing Iran and checking Iran's aspirations. So, that's one of the interesting things, though, that I've found out kind of coming out of this book, and my good friend and partner, Wes Mitchell, I think it makes this point, is that actually where the most creative diplomacy is going to be necessary is in these secondary theaters that remain important, but where are not the primary theater. So the primary theater is going to get the fundamental attention and the military attention and so forth. But we're still going to have interest, and we're going to have to try to work with other partners with less to get the outcomes we want. The Middle East is a great example, as is Europe.
Great, thanks. I want to pivot slightly to the headlines. You mentioned the DoD report that came out earlier this week. One of the striking things to me was the forecasting of China's nuclear capabilities. So before you had the pen on the NDS, you in previous roles had done a lot of thinking on nuclear policy. So how should we address China's growing nuclear capabilities, their nuclear arsenal, as we're considering maybe some of our own modernization efforts?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I would say is just how significant this is, because, at multiple levels. I mean, it's really proof that the Chinese have completely abandoned any pretense of having a restrained approach to their place in the world. I mean, for decades, going back to Mao Zedong himself, the Chinese had attached, speaking of credibility, they had attached their credibility of their geopolitical objectives to their restraint in their nuclear forces, right? So they would say, look, we're a peaceful state or whatever, peaceful rise. And you can tell because, look, we've had this very minimum deterrent. And, they'd inch up here and there, but basically it was pretty, and over the last 10 years, that's just been completely blown up. And they're building a nuclear force that's basically designed to take on the United States. And that shows that we shouldn't believe that they have geopolitical restraint. It also shows that they're building a military to fight, right? Because what they're doing, I think, is they're building a military to win conventionally and then shift the burden of heavier burden of escalation onto us. Because the problem for them is if they win conventionally, but we have a decisive nuclear advantage, we could escalate to the nuclear level and they would lose. They'd have to give up, basically. And what they're doing is they're building a variegated, sophisticated nuclear force that's going to make it insane for us to do that. And if it's insane for us to do, we're almost certainly not going to do it. And as Admiral Richard, the Stratcom commander, said the other day, they're basically building a force that's going to enable them to pursue whatever nuclear employment strategy they want. And they're going to have 1,000 deployable warheads by the end of the decade. That's 2/3 of what our operationally deployed force actually may even be more than what we have at any given time. Now, I mean, these are kind of accounting tricks to some extent. A lot of the numbers that people look at in our bigger numbers are warheads awaiting dismantlement, or they wouldn't ever realistically be deployed in a war. So it's very sobering. And I think I think we're going to have to rethink our nuclear approach because, unlike in conventional forces, I don't want to be vulnerable to either the Chinese or the Russians. So we're going to have a nuclear force that's going to deal with both of them.
Great, thanks. Next question. I'm actually going to identify the questioner because he is a member of ASP's board of directors, and that's General Sight. And he's got a broader, Bridge, you do a fantastic job of laying out a coherent rationale for a reorientation of our defense strategy. But what about the other elements of national power? How should we be thinking about this as a true whole of government approach to addressing the China challenge?
Well, the first thing is to get the military right. They're like the cops in the neighborhood, and everything else needs to take a backseat until we get that right. Once we get that right, we can all, worry about, a more balanced approach. But my concern is that we're too balanced. That, it's like, if you're balanced in the face of and I'm not saying this of the questioner, but I do, let's get our heart disease under control. But that said, I think it absolutely, as the question suggested, we're going to have to think about this in every way. And our economic approach, I mean, I don't think we're going to fully decouple for any million reasons, but we're going to have to probably do something like what the Chinese are doing, which is reduce our exposure to their leverage. I mean, that's what dual circulation is. And I think what's going to happen is everything is going to have to be subordinated to the focus on China. That doesn't mean that everything is about China. So the Europe is a great example. Like, we should be thinking about, here's what we need to do. We need to build it and sustain this coalition in the face of China. The countries that are actually going to do something about it and have the capability are largely in Asia. We have interest in Europe. Okay, the Europeans are going to take care of that. You know, it's not that we want like the Peruvians to contribute to a Taiwan contingency, but we're not going to have a lot of, I mean, we never have a lot of forces for Southcom, but that's the way I think we're going to have to think about it. And I think our alliance and coalition building and those activities are also, you know, we're going to actually have to think more with the military piece at the forefront until we get things right. So, you know, I mentioned this, you know, arms sales to the Emirates, you know, the people who are saying, oh my gosh, non-proliferation, or oh my gosh, you know, there's, you know, the Egyptians are an authoritarian system or whatever. Well, I mean, you know, pick your poison. I mean, people need to, okay, well, if you're going to do that, then you're going to make us more vulnerable ultimately to the Chinese, which are the ultimate authoritarian power. I mean, one point here is, I don't talk as much about like, you know, the freedom agenda or what have you, but I mean, if you want democracy and freedom to flourish in the world, you don't want the Chinese to be ascendant. And so all of our instrumental steps should be subordinate to that, whether, even if they involve the compromise of principles or sort of people's principles or how they see them in these other categories. But I think that's going to be the overriding, you know, and I mean, one of the things I'm trying to do is, I mean, I believe what I'm saying, but, you know, if I take it up to 11, to quote Spinal Tap, I think it's a 10, you know, but, you know, everybody, a lot of people, you know, let's balance, and it's too much. And it's like, but the problem is, like, if they make a step with Taiwan, suddenly we're in a new situation that's going to be disastrous. And then if they do it again, you know, we're in real trouble, real trouble.
Thanks. We've only got a couple of minutes left, but I do want to get to this question. And, you know, recognizing, Bridge, you're an extremely talented defense strategist and not a sinologist, but just in your view, just the strength and resiliency of the Chinese regime itself. They're not 10 feet tall. But if you could just provide some brief comments on that before we do have a hard stop at 11:45.
No, thanks. And actually, one of the things you know, on a couple of areas where I'm not an expert, and I tried to make my model, kind of my framework, be actually compatible with a number of different perceptions. One is on Chinese, kind of the nature of the Chinese system, leadership. Another is exactly the military posture. I don't go into, you know, how many carriers we should buy or whatever, because that's my point, is to have the debate hopefully take place within the framework that I've laid out. I think on the Chinese leadership, I mean, look, I mean, they could fall apart tomorrow, but I don't think it's prudent to plan on that basis. And if we're thinking about it from a kind of insurance point of view, I'd rather over-prepare. So the risk of over-preparing is a security dilemma, but I mean, they're going gangbusters anyway. So like, I'm not so worried about a security dilemma. Plus, the force investments we're talking about are manifestly defensive. I mean, they're clearly designed to, I mean, what I'm talking about, you don't, as I tell the Russians sometimes, if we're worried about a fait accompli, that by definition means we're not going to try regime change you, because, you know, Eisenhower's response to a fait accompli in 1955 would have been to blow up the Soviet Union. That's not what we're talking about here. So, so I think that's, you know, I would rather over prepare and maybe waste money rather than under prepare and have fundamental, you know, body blow to our way of life at the end of the day. You know, but that said, I tend to be skeptical of arguments that the Chinese are about to fall apart. It sounds tendentious to me. I could be wrong. I know they got a lot of problems. We've all got a lot of problems, you know. I mean, and I grew up in Asia, but I'm not a sinologist. I'm not like, you know, I don't speak the languages, but I have a lot of experience. My family's, it's a very serious country, China. I mean, it's a very serious country. Even if they have political problems, I think they've kind of cracked the code finally, and now it's like they're game on. So I'm kind of like, whatever happens, even if there's ups and downs, we better be prepared. And I tend to think these arguments that, oh, and I'm not saying that the questioner was suggesting this, but there's this line out there that the Chinese are going to fall apart and the demographics, and I'm kind of like, I don't think so. I wouldn't bet on it.
Yeah, no, and I think your framing as an insurance policy is exactly spot on. And I must say, it's been interesting to watch the China debate evolve over the last decade or so. It seems like we initially got it wrong. No one talks about China as a responsible stakeholder anymore. The stakes here are massive. The rise of China is a world-altering event. Bridge, you certainly recognize this as the foreign policy challenge of our time. The United States is losing military dominance that we've had for decades. Technology is accelerating this in some respects, but it's also redefining the nature of military power. Bridge, you certainly recognize this, and you articulate it in the book. Denial is a limited objective, but it is quite rational and achievable. And you put forward a really compelling case. Everyone, go out and get a copy. It's available on Amazon. Buy it for your friends. And you put forward a compelling case and also provide a significant contribution to the debate. So thank you for your scholarship. Thank you for your time. And thank you for joining me as my first webinar as CEO of ASP.
Thank you, Patrick. It's been a real pleasure, and I thank you for your kind words, and thanks for everyone for participating.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. That's all we have for today. If you want to come back and revisit the conversation, it will be posted on our website. Until then, stay well.